Imagine standing on a narrow coastal plain, the sea glittering at your back, mountains pressing in from both sides. Ahead of you stretches the largest professional army the ancient world had ever assembled, tens of thousands of Persian warriors, hardened by decades of conquest, armed with composite bows that could darken the sky with arrows. Behind you, Athens, your city, your children, your entire civilization. You have roughly 10,000 men, and you choose to attack. This is not the story of a lucky escape. This is not the story of an underdog who got fortunate on the right day. What happened at Marathon in 490 BC was a masterstroke of military genius, a moment of collective courage so extraordinary that it echoed across 25 centuries, and it may have saved Western civilization as we know it. Let us go back to the beginning, because before we can understand why Marathon mattered, we need to understand just how enormous the force arrayed against Athens truly was. In the year 550 BC, a new power was rising in the east, one unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. The Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, was expanding at breathtaking speed. Within 2 generations, it had swallowed Mesopotamia, Egypt, Asia Minor, and stretched its fingers all the way to the borders of India. At its peak, the Achaemenid Empire covered nearly 5.5 million square kilometers, roughly the size of the entire continental United States. It was home to an estimated 50 million people, nearly half the world's population at the time. When Darius I came to power in 522 BC, he inherited this staggering empire and immediately set about making it larger. He called himself King of Kings, and that was not mere vanity. It was a precise description of reality. Dozens of vassal kings bowed before him. His armies could draw on soldiers from Persia, Media, Lydia, Egypt, Babylon, India, and dozens of other conquered lands. His navy commanded the Mediterranean and the Aegean. To stand against Darius I was not just dangerous, it was considered by almost everyone in the ancient world to be an act of suicidal madness. The Greeks of mainland Greece were a loose collection of city-states, quarrelsome, fiercely independent, often at war with each other. Sparta was the military powerhouse. Athens was growing in wealth and intellectual ambition. Corinth controlled trade routes. Thebes, Argos, Megara, each city had its own laws, its own gods, its own army. There was no Greece as a unified political entity, just a fractured constellation of proud, stubborn, occasionally brilliant communities clinging to rocky coastlines and mountain valleys. Darius looked at Greece the way a chess grandmaster eyes an obvious next move. But then something happened that would push a military campaign from eventually to immediately. It was a rebellion that lit the fuse. In 499 BC, the Greek cities of Ionia, located along the western coast of modern-day Turkey, which had been under Persian control for decades, rose up against their Persian masters. They called it the Ionian Revolt. The Ionians were Greeks. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, wrote Greek poetry. But for a generation, they had lived under Persian governors, paid Persian taxes, and sent their sons to fight in Persian armies. They had had enough. The rebellion spread quickly. And when the Ionian cities sent messengers to mainland Greece asking for help, most cities politely looked the other way. The Spartans refused outright. This was not their problem. But Athens sent 20 ships. Eretria sent 5. It was not much, but it was enough to make Darius furious. The Athenians and their Eretrian allies helped the Ionians sack and burn Sardis, one of the great cities of the Persian Empire, the former capital of the Lydian kingdom. The fire lit in Sardis could be seen for miles. When the news reached Darius in his palace at Persepolis, according to the ancient historian Herodotus, the King of Kings asked one of his servants to remind him every single day who the Athenians were. "Master, remember the Athenians," the servant was commanded to say each time the king sat down to dinner. For 6 years, Darius remembered. The Ionian Revolt was eventually crushed. The Persians systematically reduced the rebel cities, enslaving populations, executing leaders. By 494 BC, it was over. The Persians had won. But that was not enough. The humiliation demanded a reckoning. Athens and Eretria had stuck their noses into Persian affairs, and they would pay. In 492 BC, Darius launched his first attempt at punishing Greece. He sent a large army under his son-in-law Mardonius, accompanied by a massive fleet. The land force marched through Thrace and Macedonia. The fleet sailed the northern Aegean. Everything was going according to plan until a violent storm off the rocky promontory of Mount Athos destroyed 300 Persian ships and drowned 20,000 men. The army, vulnerable without naval support, was harassed by Thracian tribes and limped home. Darius would not be deterred. The following year, he sent heralds to every city in Greece with a simple, non-negotiable demand: earth and water, the ancient symbols of submission. Many cities, looking at the size of the Persian Empire and calculating the odds, quietly handed over the symbolic offerings. They would become what the Greeks called Medizers, those who collaborated with the Medes, a term used interchangeably with Persians. But not Athens, and not Sparta. The Athenian response was legendary in its defiance. They threw the Persian heralds into a pit, a form of execution reserved for criminals. Sparta went even further. They threw their heralds into a well with the dark suggestion that they could find their earth and water down there. Word of this insult reached Darius in Persepolis. He began planning his second expedition, and this time he would not fail. In 490 BC, Darius dispatched his finest generals, Datis, a Mede of great experience, and Artaphernes, his own nephew, with an expeditionary force of somewhere between 25,000 and 100,000 men. Ancient sources disagree wildly on the numbers. Modern historians generally estimate around 25,000 combat troops supported by cavalry and a massive fleet of perhaps 600 ships. The strategy was elegant. Rather than march overland through the disaster-prone northern route, the Persians would sail directly across the Aegean island, hopping southward. They stopped at Naxos, burning the city in revenge for a previous revolt. They stopped at Delos, the sacred island of Apollo, and respectfully left it untouched, a shrewd piece of psychological warfare, signaling that the Persians were civilized conquerors, not mindless destroyers. Then they sailed to Eretria. Eretria had been one of the cities that sent ships to support the Ionian Revolt. It had been on Darius's list for years. The city, its population panicking, debated what to do. Some wanted to flee to the mountains. Others argued for resistance. In the end, they chose to fight and were betrayed from within. After 6 days of siege, Persian sympathizers inside the walls opened the gates. The Persians poured in, looted, and burned the temples, and enslaved the entire population. The Eretrian captives were marched to the coast, loaded onto ships, and eventually transported to Persia, where they would spend the rest of their lives as a living trophy of imperial revenge. The Athenians watched all of this from across the water, and understood with terrible clarity they were next. Now Datis and Artaphernes needed to choose their landing site in Attica, the region surrounding Athens. They had brought with them a man who knew the land intimately, Hippias, the exiled former tyrant of Athens, a bitter old man in his 80s who dreamed of being reinstalled as ruler under Persian patronage. Hippias pointed them toward Marathon, a coastal plain roughly 40 kilometers northeast of Athens. It was the perfect choice. The plain was flat enough to deploy cavalry. It was close enough to Athens to threaten the city quickly, and there was a road that led directly toward the Athenian walls. When the Persian fleet appeared on the horizon, the Athenians moved with remarkable speed. They assembled their army, roughly 10,000 hoplite soldiers, armored citizen soldiers who formed the backbone of Greek warfare, and marched north to Marathon. They sent a messenger to Sparta begging for help. That messenger, a professional runner named Pheidippides, covered the 240 kilometers to Sparta in just 2 days. An almost superhuman feat of endurance. The Spartan response was sympathetic but maddeningly frustrating. They were in the middle of a religious festival, the Carneia, during which Spartan law forbade military action. They would come, they promised, after the festival, in a few days. A few days might mean the fall of Athens. The Athenians also sent word to the Plataeans, a small city-state that had a long-standing alliance with Athens. The Plataeans, in one of history's most touching acts of solidarity, sent every single fighting man they had. Perhaps 1,000 soldiers. It was not much. But to the Athenians, it was everything. And so the Greek force, roughly 11,000 men in total, marched to the plain of Marathon and set up camp in the hills above the Persian landing site, blocking the 2 roads that led inland toward Athens. For several days, nothing happened. The Persians were waiting. The Greeks were waiting. Each side was watching the other, calculating. The Persian commanders, aware of their cavalry advantage, wanted the Greeks to come down on to the flat plain. The Greeks, aware of the Persian cavalry, wanted to stay in the hills, where horses were useless. This standoff might have lasted indefinitely, but something happened that broke the deadlock. Among the 10 Athenian generals commanding the Greek forces, one man understood that waiting was not a neutral act. It was slow defeat. His name was Miltiades, and he was perhaps the most experienced military commander in Athens. He had once served as a ruler in the Chersonese, a Greek territory in Thrace, and had spent years watching Persian military tactics up close. He knew how they fought. He knew their strengths. And crucially, he thought he had spotted their weakness. The Athenian generals were not a unified command. Each one of the 10 generals had equal authority, and they took turns serving as commander-in-chief one day at a time. The political arrangement that worked reasonably well in peacetime was potentially catastrophic in war. Miltiades worked furiously to persuade his colleagues. The Persians, he argued, were not invincible. Their army was powerful, yes, but it depended on cavalry. And the cavalry, for reasons that remain debated by historians to this day, appeared to be temporarily absent from the battlefield. Perhaps the horses were being watered. Perhaps they had been loaded back onto ships as part of a feint toward Athens. Whatever the reason, this was the window. When his day as supreme commander came, Miltiades ordered the attack. What happened next was one of the most audacious military maneuvers in ancient history. The Greek hoplites, heavily armored in bronze breastplates, greaves, and helmets, each carrying a large round shield and a long spear, formed up in a long line across the plain. And then at Miltiades' command, they did something extraordinary. They ran. Not a slow advance, not a cautious walk. They charged at a dead run toward the Persian lines, approximately a mile of open ground covered at sprinting pace. The Persians were astonished. The ancient historian Herodotus tells us they thought the Greeks had gone mad, out of their minds and rushing to destruction. The Persian archers began to fire, but the charging Greeks covered the killing ground so quickly that the volleys of arrows could not decimate them as planned. The Greek line, as Miltiades had designed it, was deliberately uneven. The center was deliberately weakened, stretched thin to allow the flanks to be reinforced. This seemed like a dangerous gamble, and it was. But it was also a trap. When the two sides clashed, the battle erupted with brutal intensity. The Persian center, which contained their best troops, the immortals, the elite infantry, who had never been defeated, pushed hard against the thin Greek center. The Greeks in the middle bent. Then they gave ground. The Persians pressed forward, sensing victory surging through the gap. But on the wings, the story was completely different. The reinforced Greek flanks crashed into the Persian wings with overwhelming force. The Persians on the sides were routed, scattered, broken, fleeing toward the sea. And now came the masterstroke. The victorious Greek flanks did not pursue the fleeing Persians. Instead, under extraordinary battlefield discipline that would have been nearly impossible to maintain in the chaos of ancient combat, they turned inward. They wheeled around, and they fell upon the Persian center from both sides. The Persian force, which a moment ago had believed it was winning, suddenly found itself surrounded. The collapse was total. The Persians broke and ran, not toward a disciplined withdrawal, but in panicked, chaotic flight back toward their ships. The Greeks pursued them to the shore. The slaughter on the beach was terrible. 7 Persian ships were captured. The rest managed to escape. When the carnage was counted, the Greeks had lost 192 men. The Persians' estimates vary, but Herodotus says 6,400 lay dead on the plain of Marathon. But the battle was not over. Not quite. The Persian fleet, battered but intact, did not sail home. It turned south. Darius and Artaphernes had a new plan: sail around the peninsula of Attica and reach Athens by sea before the victorious Greek army could march back to defend it. Someone was going to signal the fleet, a treasonous act that has puzzled historians for millennia. According to some ancient sources, a shield was raised and tilted to catch the sunlight as the Persians rounded the cape, a signal from a Persian sympathizer inside Attica that the city was undefended. The Athenian generals understood the danger immediately. They didn't celebrate. They didn't rest. The 10,000 soldiers who had just fought one of the most intense battles in history gathered themselves up, still covered in blood, still exhausted, still wearing their armor, and marched. They covered the 40 kilometers back to Athens in a single forced march, arriving before the Persian fleet could enter the harbor. When the Persian ships appeared off the coast of Athens, they found the Greek army drawn up on the shore, ready and waiting. Darius looked at the Athenian position. He considered his options, and then he ordered the fleet to sail away. The crisis was over. One of the men who ran from Marathon to Athens with the news of the victory, the messenger who gave us the modern marathon race, reportedly cried out, "We have won," and then collapsed and died from the effort. The man's name in most ancient sources is given as Pheidippides, the same runner who had carried the message to Sparta, though historians debate the details. What is certain is that the image burned itself into Greek memory, a man running until his heart burst, carrying news too important to wait. The aftermath of Marathon rippled outward in ways that would shape the next century of history, and through that century, the entire arc of Western civilization. For the Greeks, and especially for Athens, Marathon was not merely a military victory. It was a transformation of self-understanding. Before Marathon, many Greeks assumed that the Persians were simply superior, too numerous, too experienced, too powerful to resist. The assumption of inevitable Persian dominance had led dozens of cities to offer earth and water without a fight. Marathon destroyed that assumption forever. It proved that Greek hoplites, citizen soldiers, men with jobs and families and farm fields, could stand in the open field against the world's greatest professional army and win. Not through luck, not through divine intervention. Through discipline, tactical genius, and raw courage. Athens celebrated its victory with the passion of a city that had genuinely stared into the abyss and walked away. The 192 Athenian dead were buried at Marathon itself in a burial mound, the Soros that still exists today, rather than being brought home. This was almost unprecedented in Athenian custom. It was a declaration that these men were heroes in the truest Greek sense figures who transcended ordinary death. For Darius I, Marathon was a humiliation that demanded revenge. But fate denied him his second chance. In 486 BC, Egypt revolted, and Darius died while preparing his armies. Some ancient sources say the news of the Egyptian uprising literally broke his health. He never returned to Greece. His son Xerxes inherited the throne, the empire, and his father's obsession. Xerxes spent 4 years preparing the largest military expedition the ancient world had ever seen. He would come back to Greece. He would not make the same mistakes. He would bring an army so vast it would simply overwhelm any resistance by sheer weight of numbers. A bridge of boats would be laid across the Hellespont. Mountains would be tunneled through for the fleet. The entire might of the Persian Empire would be focused on one target, Greece. And that campaign, the Second Persian Invasion of 480 BC, would give the world the names of Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea. It would give the world the image of 300 Spartans holding a mountain pass against an army of millions. It would produce some of the most dramatic military stories in all of human history, but none of it would have been possible without Marathon, because Marathon bought Athens 10 years, 10 extraordinary years in which Athens built a navy, the fleet that would eventually destroy the Persian armada at Salamis. 10 years in which Athenian democracy deepened and flourished. 10 years in which the poets, philosophers, and playwrights who would define the golden age of Athens were growing up absorbing the story of Marathon, understanding that their city was capable of the extraordinary. Aeschylus, the father of tragedy, one of the greatest playwrights in human history, fought at Marathon. He was there on that plain in the bronze armor, in the blood and chaos. When he died decades later, his epitaph mentioned only one thing that he had fought at Marathon. Not his plays, not his literary genius, just he had been there. There is one more dimension of Marathon that history books sometimes underplay, and it deserves to be said clearly. What was at stake at Marathon was not just the fate of Athens. It was the fate of an idea so radical, so fragile, so new that it had barely had a generation to take root. Democracy. Athens had only recently invented democratic governance. The reforms of Cleisthenes in 508 BC, just 18 years before Marathon, had created the world's first genuine democracy, a system in which citizens, not kings, made the laws and decided the direction of their community. It was imperfect, limited to free male citizens riddled with contradictions, but it was real and it was vulnerable. If Hippias, the exiled tyrant, had been reinstalled in Athens under Persian patronage, as was clearly Darius's plan, democracy would have been strangled in its infancy. The idea that ordinary citizens could govern themselves, that law, was superior to any individual, that leaders owed accountability to the people. All of it might have died on that coastal plain northeast of Athens. We would not know what we lost. The trajectory of Greek philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and all the chains of thought that flowed from them was not inevitable. It was contingent on Athens surviving on Athenian democracy, surviving on the culture of free inquiry that democracy nurtured being allowed to flower. The Romans who inherited so much from Greece might never have received this inheritance. The Renaissance, which rediscovered the classical world and ignited modernity, might have found a much thinner tradition to revive. The Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. All of this is woven from threads that stretch back to the specific choices made by specific men on a specific morning in September of 490 BC. This is not to say that history is ever the result of a single battle. History is never that simple. But Marathon was one of those rare moments when a particular door was held open barely by the shoulders of 10,000 exhausted, terrified, brilliant men. And because it stayed open, everything that came after was possible. Stand on the plain of Marathon today, and the landscape is surprisingly unchanged. The mountains still press in from the northwest. The sea still glitters to the east. The Soros, the burial mound of the 192 Athenians, still rises from the flat earth, a low green hill that seems almost modest for what it marks. Every year, the Athens Classic Marathon runs the same route that the ancient messenger ran from Marathon to the Panathenaic Stadium in Athens. 42 kilometers and change. Tens of thousands of runners from around the world make that journey, most of them with no particular interest in ancient history, drawn simply by the mythic resonance of the route. They are running in the footsteps of a civilization's survival. The legend of the runner who died delivering his message has always moved people. Not because the story is certainly true, historians debate its details endlessly, but because it captures something emotionally real about that day. The idea that a man ran until he had nothing left, that he burned himself out completely in the service of news so important it could not wait, that the last thing he did with the final measure of his strength was to tell his city that it was safe. That image is Marathon, not the tactics, not the numbers, not even the geopolitical consequences. The image of a man choosing to run until he was done. Because what the Battle of Marathon really shows us, stripped of all its strategic analysis and historical significance, is something about human will, about what people do when they understand that something worth protecting is genuinely under threat. The Athenians at Marathon chose to fight when they could have submitted. Miltiades chose to attack when he could have waited. The Plataeans chose to march to the aid of their ally when they could have stayed home and hoped the storm would pass. They ran toward the danger, and the world they preserved flawed, incomplete, full of injustice and contradiction, but alive with the possibility of becoming better, is still, in a very real sense, the world we live in. 25 centuries have passed since that morning on the plain of Marathon. The Persian Empire is dust. The city-states of ancient Greece are dust. The names of most of the 10,000 men who fought there are lost forever. But the idea they fought for, that a free people governing themselves by their own laws are worth defending, is still alive. And every time we remember that idea, every time we defend it, every time we insist that it matters, we are in some small way still running. If this story moved you, if you found yourself even for a moment standing on that plain, subscribe to this channel. Because there are hundreds more stories like this one moment when history held its breath, when the world balanced on a knife's edge, when the choices of ordinary people echoed across centuries. We tell those stories here. Don't miss the next one.